Hey guys, it's Gary from DisplacedIdeas.com, and today we're going to be talking about saving objects to SQLite in Universal Windows apps. Before we get started, the first thing you want to do is download SQL Server Compact SQLite Toolbox. This is an add-on for Visual Studio that we're going to be using, and you can see it up here in the right corner. It allows us to look at our databases and you'll see how that works as we go along. But you want to install that first before we get started. Once you have that installed, then we're going to go ahead and create a new app, and we're just going to call this Objects to SQLite, and it's just a blank universal app. And whatever the targets are, just use those. Okay, once we're loaded up, first thing I like to do is just get rid of this frame rate counter. That just stops the numbers from flashing up in the corners of your app while you're testing. Okay, so we have our app and our app solution. The first thing we need to do is build some references. So we're going to go to Tools, Extensions and Updates, and we want to look for the SQL packages. You want to make sure that you have your toolbox installed. You want to make sure that you have SQL for Universal Windows Platform, or SQLite, sorry, and SQLite for Windows Runtime. Make sure you have all three of those in there and they're all installed. Once you have those installed, we right-click on References and click Add Reference. And under Universal Windows, we go to Extensions, and we're going to want two extensions out of here. One of them is the the SQLite Universal Windows Platform, and the other one is Visual C++ 2015 Runtime for Universal Windows. And click OK, and that'll add them. And then there's one more reference we need to add, but we're going to go to Tools, and we're going to go to NuGet Package Manager, and then the Manage NuGet Package for Solution. And in here, we're going to look up, click Browse, and look up SQLite PCL. Okay, no space, all one word. And then you're going to get SQLite PCL by Microsoft Technologies. And you're going to want to install this. So you click on Objects to SQLite, click Install, and let that install for you. Once that's installed, all of your references are taken care of. You can close this and close this. So now we're ready to start programming. The first thing we're going to do is go to our main page XAML. And we're going to do a little bit of design work here. This is going to be extremely simple design work, just to show what our programming is going to be doing. First thing we need is two buttons on the top. And then we're going to need 6 text blocks. And we're going to orient those like this. I'm just using Control C and then Control V to copy and paste. So you can do 2, 3, and I'm going to leave a space and do 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and then we're going to have 7 text boxes. So we'll take our text box, and I think we're going to have to separate these a little bit, but anyway. Copy, paste. 2, 3, we're going to put 1 here, space that a little bit, and then we're going to go down here and do 1, 2, 3 down here. Now we can organize these a little bit better, and then we can go through and name these. So our first button is going to just be called button add, so pt1 add, and then in the contents just do add. Our second button is going to be pt1 retrieve, and then of course retrieve. Then our database is going to be based on a car. So some car information is what we're going to put in here. So we're going to do, for the label, we're not going to worry about the name. We're just going to do make, model, and year. And down here, we're going to make this lookup, make, lookup, model, and lookup, year. Now these tell us the names of these boxes also. So here we're going to have TB make, and we'll take the text that they have in out of the box and leave it blank. This one's going to be TB model. Again, we'll take the text box out. And the last one is going to be TB year, but instead of just taking the text out, we're going to just change the text to a 0. And then down here, we can make this TB lookup make, TB lookup model, and TB lookup year. And this one we don't need a 0. Now this little box in the middle, we're just going to call this TB results, because we're just going to use that to spit out some results as we go along. So essentially what we're setting up here is these are all our inputs, and these are going to be what we're going to pull back out. So this is going to be the information we're going to put into the database. This is the information we're going to get back out of the database. So we're never actually going to write into any of these or the result from the main screen. And you can, if you were doing this for production, you'd want to make sure that nobody could go in and change these. It really doesn't matter for what we're doing here. So we're just going to save this, and that's going to be the end of everything we're going to do on this design box. So we're just going to close this out. And next we're going to work on a couple of classes. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is create it, and we're going to create an object that we're going to be using throughout this example. So what I like to do is keep my stuff really organized. So I'm going to add a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder objects, and that's where I'm going to keep my objects. And I'm also going to make a new folder called handlers, and I'll explain that one in a minute. So now you can set this up any way you like. This is just for me to try to keep things separate for what we're doing here and keep it easier for you to find in your mind. So we're going to right click on objects and we're going to add a new class, and we're going to call this class car, because this is going to be the car we're going to save the make, the model, and the year in. And we'll just add. Okay. So now let's build our car class. First thing is we want to be able to use this class throughout the program that we're doing. So we're going to just make this public, and now we'll be able to see the class throughout our project. Now if you're familiar with this shortcut, there is a shortcut. We need to add the 3 properties, the make, the model, and the year. And the quickest way to do this is to type in PROP and hit tab twice. And that brings up all the property information that you need. And you change int to string, and you hit tab twice, and we'll call this make, and hit enter twice. Now you're on to the next one, PROP, tab, string, tab, model, enter. And then the last one, PROP, tab. We're going to leave this one in integer, so don't touch that, just hit tab one time, and type in year, enter. And that's our car class. Every car we have, every car we create, it's going to have just these 3 things. Okay. Now today we're only going to be talking about making one car class, saving one car class to the database, and retrieving that one car class back, and then being able to work with it as a car class again. So essentially, the whole reason we want to save an object to the database is because if we don't save the object, we'd have to save make, model, and year separately. And if you have a lot more of this type of information that you're saving for a car, like your, I don't know, the wheels, the tires, the engine, the transmission, brakes, suspension, whatever, you would have to save each one of those items to the database. By being able to save an object to the database, you'll be able to keep all that information in one place together and just save car, and it'll save all that information for that particular car. Then all you need to do is look up that car, and you'll have all that information again for that particular car. So that's the way we're going to be doing this. Now, we're done with that car class. Now, obviously, we want to save this to some sort of database. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a SQLite database file in our file system. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to go to our handlers folder. And I think of a handlers folder as objects are actually items. They're things that you're doing something with. A handler is something that it's a class that you use as a liaison between 2 different things. And we're going to use this class as a liaison between the database and our program. So this is going to be the database handler. So we're going to create a class, and we're just going to call it database. Some people will just put all their classes together and call this a database handler as the name. You can do it that way too, but here again, the first thing we want to do is make this public so we can use it throughout the rest of the program. Do not forget this public. If you forget to put public in your class, you'll go to use your class somewhere else, and you'll come up with all kinds of strange error messages that will send you searching around in different places, and you won't realize exactly what's going on until you finally find out it's just because you forgot to put public in, and it can't find the class correctly. So now that we're in our database class, we need to build it. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the top here. We're going to add a using statement for our SQLite PCL, because this is what we're actually using to create our database and to send our commands and stuff to use to make our database file and to operate within it. So now we need to create a connection. So we're going to use SQLite connection. And we're just going to call it dbcon. And we make that equal to a new SQL connection. And we're going to name it cars.db. So it's a file that's going to exist on your computer called cars database, cars.db. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we need to create our database file. Or I should say we're going to create our database, which is going to be in that file. And we do that like this. Public void, we're not sending anything back. Create database. Okay, and our first step here is going to be to create a SQL string for a command. So we have our S SQL string. And it's going to be equal to, now here you just use an @ symbol, and goes between two parentheses, and you're going to have a semicolon at the end. Now inside of the parentheses, you're going to be making a command for the computer. So you want to make sure that that ends with a semicolon also. So just like you have a line here that you're sending a command to the computer and you use the semicolon for C#, inside of the parentheses, the command that we're going to write needs to end with that semicolon also. So it'll end by going semicolon, parentheses, semicolon. I hope that's easy to understand that way. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a table if it doesn't exist. So it's if not exist. And we're going to call it car info. Now I'm going to split this up a little bit to make it easier for you to see. So bear with me. The next line you're going to need is ID. We're going to make that an integer. We're going to make that our primary key. We don't need to enter it in. It's going to enter it in for us, and it's not allowed to be null. It must have something. Comma. Now we're going to go to our next field that we want to save, which in this case is going to be our object. So we're going to call this field car, and we're going to make it an nvarchar. And we're going to say that can't be null either. Okay, so now you can see that our command, create table if not exists car info, and then it has the parentheses, and it has our ID and our car inside the parentheses, ends with a semicolon. That's the command inside the quotation marks. And then our complete command is this entire line, so that needs the semicolon at the end. So I just want to make that clear for you so you understand what it's for. Now we're going to use SQLite statement to pass our statement to our SQLite database. So we'll call that CN statement, or our connection statement, equals, and we use our connection dbcon dot prepare, and we're going to prepare our S SQL statement. And then lastly, we are going to take our CN statement and step it. This runs the command for us. And that creates our database table. So we should end up with a database table that has an ID and a car field. And the ID is auto-incremented, so it's just going to go 0 to whatever every time we add a field. And the car is going to be whatever we entered in. That's going to be our object, where we're going to save our object. Okay. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to write our record into our database so we can add cars into our database. So we will write our record. And we're going to do that with a public. Again, we're not returning anything, so it's void. We're just going to call it write record. And this time we're going to need a string. I'm going to call that string car. Okay, now we just need to write our SQL string, just like we did to create the database. So we're going to write a SQL command, and we're going to do the @ symbol and our quotation marks. And don't forget that you want the semicolons. If you do those up front, then you won't forget them later. And then here we're going to use an insert command. We're going to insert into car info, our table. And then what are we going to enter into it? We're going to enter our car, our string above. Just want to make sure those are the same. Sorry. C#, you have to make sure that you have the uppercase and lowercase the same. So we're going to save car, and car is going to have a value, and then we have to enter in our value. Now this is kind of strange how they have you enter this in, but it's basically a single quotation, double quotation, space plus space, car, space plus space, double quotation, single quotation. Now there it is very important that you put those spaces in between the pluses so that it reads it correctly. So don't forget that. Now, this is to add one item, one car field to the database. Now, if you have other fields, like maybe you have, you're tracking what racetrack you're going to be at, or I don't know, an event name, you can add those like this. You just put a comma, and you can add as many as you like in between the brackets. So here would be your track, and here would be your event. Now these would either be objects, just like car is, or they would be just plain strings, or data that you're sending through, and you'd send that through up here. You'd have to make it, you know, string track, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a string. It can be an integer or whatever. But event was a bad word. It's a naughty word to use in C#. You have to use something else. So, you know, that would have to be like race event or something like that. So that's why it's giving me a hard time. See, there it would work. Okay, so that's how you'd add more than one. And then you'd have to put values for each one. So here you need to have a comma. And then in between each one you have your single quotation, double quotation, space plus space, whatever it's going to be, track, and then space plus space, your double quotation mark and your single quotation mark. And you just do that right down the line also. So if you're going to do your race event, there it is. Now this would add 3 fields, however they're brought in, whether it's string, integer, or whatever. and they would have the names of the fields on this side and the value that goes to the name of the field on this side. The only thing that's important is the order. Car has to be first, track must be second, race event must be third. Okay, now we're just doing car to make everything as simple as possible, so we're just going to take this off of here. But you could do that with as many objects or with as many variables as you'd like. Okay, and then next we have to make our connection, so we need our dbcon again, and we need to prepare it. And of course we're going to pass that our SQL statement. And now we can just do this to kind of shorthand it a little bit and step right there. And that's it. That record's written. I'm not going to include a lot of validation on anything. So there are errors that could occur if people are entering in the wrong information. That's up to you to go back through. That's not what it's too much for just this course. So just be aware of that. If you see something in there and you're wondering why I'm not checking to make sure it's an integer when it needs to be, or that's why I'm just doing this as an example and trying to keep the code as small as possible so that you can understand what's going on easy enough without a lot of extraneous code in here. Okay, so our last one is going to be, once we get our record into our database, we want to be able to get our record back out of the database and get our object out of the database. So we're going to read our database, our record. We're going to start this the same way, public. This time we're going to return a string, because that's what we entered in. Now here, again, if you're going to be doing more than one object, like here we have the car, the track, and the race event, you wouldn't return a string. You might return an array or a list. Also, we're only doing one record at a time. So if you're doing more than one car at a time, you would do like a list of cars and, transfer that back. This is just to show you the basics. Okay, we're just going to call this read record. Read records. And we need an integer. Now this can be any of the fields that you have, however you want to be able to look them up. In this case, I'm going to try to do it very simple by just doing a record lookup, a record ID lookup. So we're going to make this record ID. And I'll explain a little bit more of that a little bit later. Okay, now the first thing we need to do is create our SQL string, just like we did before. So we start with our string. And here we go again with the @ and our quotation marks. And don't forget your 2 semicolons. And this time we're going to use a select statement. And we're not going to be real picky. So we're just going to select everything from car info. And it's just going to send all the records down. Now you can use select statements to pull down just specific items and do that kind of stuff here. We're going to kind of divide that down a little bit later, but for right now, that's all we're going to use. And then we're going to use an SQLite statement. We're going to call it cn statement again. And we're going to equal that to our database connection. And we're going to prepare our SQLite statement. So now that's going to go up to the database, pull down everything from our car info table. So now that we have everything, we need to know what we want to return. So while our cn statement .step equals a row, so we need SQLite result.row. Okay, so while there's a row there, It's going to read through the records. It's going to see all the different records as a row. While there's another row, just keep iterating through this loop. We're just going to start an if statement. Okay, if our statement, and then we're going to pass in the field we want to check. In this case, it's ID that was created for our database earlier in the creation process. So that's ID we're going to be looking for. That's usually going to be an integer. If that equals the record ID that was passed in, we're going to change that integer into a string and see if it equals the integer that was sent to us as a string. There's other ways you could do that, but just to simplify for right now. That will check to make sure if the first record that it comes to, where the ID equals whatever ID we put in, that's what it's going to show, and we're going to return that statement's car field. Just make sure that it's in the correct facet that we want, and if it doesn't return anything, you want to make sure that it's going to return something. Now, by doing this isn't really going to help much. This should be more of should be taken care of more closely. What's going to happen is, if it doesn't find the record ID, it's going to come back and give us an error that it found an inappropriate character of C. So that's okay. You can deal with that in an if statement when you look up the record. But for right now, that's as simple as I can get it for your 3 items. Okay, and that's all we're going to do with the database. So we can close that. And now we can work on our actual page. So we're going to bring up our code behind. Actually, we're going to bring up our page one more time. And we can double click on add. And that will take us to our code behind. And now if you click on your XAML page and double click on retrieve, that will take you there. And now it does the pinouts for both the buttons for us. And then we just hit save to save those. And then we can flesh this out. So we have our 2 buttons. And there's going to be a few functions that we need to build for how we're going to process the information. Okay, before we do the buttons, I'm just going to go through and highlight what we're going to be doing. The add button will add whatever information we put into the database, and the retrieve button will retrieve it back from the database. So our first function will be to build our car object graph. So we're going to build an object graph for car. And the object graph is what it's going to use to save into the database, and we'll go over that in a minute. The next thing we're going to do is convert our object into JSON. JSON is very much like XML. It seems to be the way people are going. They tend to like it. It's a little more shorthand, a little more robust on what you can do with it. It's a JavaScript notation language. Then the next thing we're going to do is, this is going to be a string of JSON, which basically is the JSON code, but it's just going to be in a string format so we can save it to our database. So we're going to take the object, we're going to turn it into JSON code, which keeps the nuances of the object together, so you can deserialize it later, and it serializes it down into a string that we can actually use to save to our database. Then we're going to write to the database. And this is going to be our string object that we created in JSON. Then, of course, we need to get our object back from the database. So and lastly, we need to, this is going to be our string object we're going to get back. And then we need to convert our string object back to an object. So those are going to be our 5 helper functions that are going to work throughout and do all the work for us. So let's get started on the first one. First one is going to be our object graph for car. Now, object graph is basically just a description of car. We're going to create a car object, and we're going to tell it what needs to be what needs to be put into that object. So we're going to start with a private, and we're going to return an object of car. So we're in our objects folder, so we're going to return a car, and we're just going to call this build car object. And then we'll start with a variable, and we'll call it my car. And we'll equal that to a new object of car. Now again, just a reminder, it helps you to remember that car is an object because it's in the objects folder. But this is not telling the computer that car is an object. This is just telling the computer that it's in the objects folder. Okay, so it's not really a descriptive word for the computer. It's a descriptive word for you, so you know what's in there and so you know what folder it's in. Now we just need to create our objects. So we just start with my car dot make equals. Now we could just write something in here. It could be just a string. You know, we could just do Chevy, and that would work fine. Except that it would be kind of docile to build an object that has information that you already know. So the whole purpose of this is to use the text boxes that we have on the main window and let the user enter it in. So we'll go to our TB make, and we want to make sure that we're getting our text field from that, and that's going to be the make. And then we do my car.model, and that's going to be coming from text box model, and that's going to be the text. And lastly, we have my car year, and that's going to come from text box year.text. Okay, you see it's giving an error, and the reason is because my car year in our database object is an integer. See, if I hover it over it, it tells you integer object car year, where model was a string and make was a string, so it was okay to use text for those. So to convert this, it's not difficult. All you do is type in int, you want it to become an integer, and you're going to parse it as an integer, and this is what you're going to parse. And I forgot the period, sorry. So you can see parse will come up on here. And there you go. Now it's going to parse that text, whatever text is put in that box, as an integer, which is why we put a 0 in that box, by the way. If whoever's typing it would type an A, a B, or C, any kind of letter or character, it wouldn't work and it would give an error message. and that'd still be the case. If they didn't enter anything and it's a null, it would probably not work, or it would just give you a 0. But although I'm not putting in the validation for that, putting the 0 in there will remind us while we're testing that it needs to be an integer for our year. Okay, and then now we're going to do then is return my car, and that's our object that we're going to pass back out of the objects. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is we need to convert our object to a string, and we'll do that with a private function. And we're not going to return anything back. We're just going to convert object to string. And we're going to put JSON so we know that it's going to be converting it to JSON. And I can spell, I see. Okay, so we're going to start out by creating a string. We're going to just call it content. And we're going to make that string empty. Then we'll create a variable, and we're going to call this myCar. And this is going to be our object that we're going to use to put into the database. So we want to build our car object. So this is going to call the function we just created, build an object, and put that as myCar. So myCar is going to equal whatever we enter in to our fields. Now we're going to use something called the data contract JSON serializer. And you're going to notice it's going to redline me right away. And if you click the little options here, you'll notice you need a using statement. So you need the using statement of system runtime serialization JSON. So we'll do that. And if you look at the top here, it added that using statement for you. Once that's in place, we can continue on. And we are going to name that just JS for our JSON serializer. And we're going to equal new, and it's going to be serializer. Make this a var. JS equals new data contract serializer. And there's a few things we need to do. You'll see it says type, so we need to check the type of. And then we need to know what type of thing are we going to serialize. And in this case, we're going to serialize our object, my car, but we can't just tell it it's my car. We need to tell it what type of object. So the type of object is going to be objects, our folder objects, car. So now it knows that we're going to take an object of car, and we're going to a type of object car, and we're going to serialize that and turn it into JS. Okay, then we need a memory stream. So here we can do var ms for memory stream equals new memory stream. Now the next thing we're actually going to do something with here, and that's we're going to take our Java serialize, and we're going to write an object to, and you'll see we need a stream and we need a object graph. Now, object graph is what we made with our object, so that's going to be our my car. And our stream is our memory stream, so memory stream and my car. So now it's going to take my car, it's going to serialize it into memory stream, and then we'll have it in memory stream to use. Now we want to change our position of our pointer in memory stream so that we're not reading from the end. You know, it just wrote to the memory stream, so now the pointer is at the end of whatever it wrote. If you try to read it from there, it's not going to read anything because there's nothing after it. So you do your memory stream, and then you just do position equals 0, and that puts it back at the beginning of the memory stream. We use var reader equals new stream reader. And we're going to pass that our memory stream. And now we take our content, we make that equal our reader, and we tell our reader to read to the end. Now, just to show what this is doing, we're going to take our result text box and we're going to feed our content into there so that you can see what it's actually doing, the JSON code you'll actually see. And then we're going to want to write our string to our database. So we're going to create a function called write string to database. We're going to send the content with it because that'll be our string. And right now it shows a red mark. That'll go away as soon as we create our writer, which will come down here, and that's going to be our next step. Now just to show you, I believe we are at a point where I can show this. I'm just going to comment that out and we're just going to run this. Provided I didn't make any typos or spelling mistakes. Take a little longer the very first time. Here we go. Now if we type in, say, Chevy Camaro and make this 1992, I don't know, and click add, oh, nothing happens. I forgot one thing, I'm sorry. We would have to go to our code, go up to our button tail, and we have to tell it we want to convert our object to string JSON. So we need to call that to get things rolling. Now that we run it, Chevy Camaro 1982 add, boom, this is JSON code. So now we'll continue on, and let's see, I have to uncomment that and it will give me an error, and I'll show you that the error will go away in just a moment. So our next stop is to write the string to database. So we'll go again with a private function. We're not going to give anything back. And you can see that that still has a red line only because I have to enter in here that we want a string. And we're going to call that my car string, just so that we know where it's coming from. And you notice my red line disappeared because now it's going to call this. So now we can close that out of the way. Make this a little simpler, easier to read. What I'm going to do here is we're just going to start with a variable. We're going to call it db, and it's going to equal a new, this time it's going to be handlers database. Okay, so we're going to create a new class of database, a new object of database, and we're going to use that. Don't forget our parentheses here at the end. And then we can go to the database and call some commands. Let's start with create database because we want to create our new database file. And then we go to DB. And we want to write our record, right? So we're going to go to write record. Now, write record, we need to pass it a string. So we're going to pass it the string that was just passed to us, which is my car string. So that's that JSON string that we just created. And we can use that to save it to our database. And then we go to our database. And we want to go to our database connection. Oh, database con. And we want to dispose of it. That helps if you're going to go back in later to read. It doesn't give you an error message because it closed the connection. And they have to reopen the connection for whatever they're doing. So by closing the connection, it saves everything in the database and you're ready to go. Now, last thing we need to do here is just let everybody know. So TB results. We don't want to take away text. Let's see. We don't want to take away what's in the results. So we're just going to go to results.text and leave whatever's there. Space plus space, and then we're just going to say data. We'll give a space or two here. Written successfully. Okay, so now we wrote our information to our database. Makes it quick, easy, and simple. Now that we wrote our information to our database, we want to get our information back from our database. So we want to make sure that we actually wrote something. So here we're going to just get our object, our single object from the database. So we'll start with a private again, void, and we'll get our object string. From the database. Okay. And this is going to be extremely difficult here. We create a variable, we call it database. And we equal that to a new handlers database. Now we created a new class of database. And then in that, we need to just do, we're going to call another function that we're going to create. And this one's going to be called convert string to object. And it's going to be the database object we just created. We're going to read our records. So we're going to call the read records function. And the read records function, we need a ID number. Now, normally our ID number would start with 0, which is fine. We can use 0. This is just for this example, though. If you write to the database and you get more than one record, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you decide to delete 0, it will delete the 0 record, and your database will start with 1, 2, 3, 4. Any one that you delete in the middle, it'll always add new ones to the end, and it will delete off the ones that you're deleting out. So just be aware of that, because if you call for this record, if you call for record 0, and let's say you added a record, and you deleted that record, and then you added another record. Now you only have one record in there, but that record's ID number is going to be 1. Because you had one that took for 0, and you deleted that one. So it always adds the next in the index. That's part of the auto increment. So just be aware that if you don't have that 0, this number will change. So you could make this, instead of using the ID number, maybe save um, a string calling it, like if you're tracking the tracks, save add an extra field in your database called tracks, and then add an extra text box, call that tracks, TB tracks, and then you just pass that in instead of looking up for a record, you read the records as tracks. So if you go into your database, I don't want to over explain this, but I do want to make sure you understand what's going on. So I apologize if I'm being long-winded. But if you go into read objects, instead of passing in an integer of record ID and then comparing that to the ID of the record, you could pass in a string of track and then have your track field from your database and have that equal whatever you enter in for the track. So then, like if you're going to Pocono or Long Island or whatever, you can type in Pocono, and when you hit retrieve, it'll retrieve the car that you used at track for Pocono. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense to you. But for just our example here, we're just going to use 0. And of course you can see it's giving us an error, and that's because we didn't create that yet. So that's going to be our last function that we need to create. And for this one, we're going to start with a private function. And we're not going to return anything. We're going to call it convert string to object. And then we're going to say that we need to receive string car object string. And you can see our error went away. So it's able to call this one. And we're going to start with a variable, call it my car. This is going to be our object. So this equals new objects dot car. We need another variable for our Java serializer, or our JSON serializer, sorry, equal that to a new, and here we're going to use data contract JSON serializer again. And of course we need to tell it the type, so it's type of objects dot car. And this time we need to decipher the encoding of the serialization so we can send the bit array through the stream reader. So this is a byte, and we're just going to call this a byte array. That's just its name. And we need to look at encoding. Now you notice I get a red line with encoding. And if we go over here, you'll see there's a using statement for that, system text. So that should add system text up to our using statements for us. And our coding type, you can pick off of this list here, is going to be UTF-8. And then we want to get the bytes, not the byte count. And then we're going to enter that into the string. So we have our car object string. Okay, so now it's going to give us a bit array of that car object string. So now it's able to convert that or deserialize it back to an object. So now we have a variable, and we're going to call this ms for our memory string. And it's going to equal, of course, a new memory string. Memory stream, I'm sorry, I'm not talking correctly. And we're going to pass that byte array into that stream. And lastly, we take our my car, which is our object. And we're going to equal that to, and we need to tell it what kind of an object. So it's objects.car. Watch your capitalization if you're not pulling it from IntelliSense. Anyway, our JSON script, our JSON serialization here, and we're going to read that object from the memory stream, ms. And now we have an object again. We just took our string from JSON, we converted it into a byte array, sent it through a stream, and created an object out of that stream. Now all that's left is to show that it's actually an object and use that object for displaying the information on the screen. So we'll go to our lookup make.text, and we'll equal that to my car.make. And I like to add the toString just to make sure everything's copacetic. And we'll do that for the other two. We just took an object, we created the object of car with whatever was entered in by the user. We converted that object to JSON. We wrote that JSON to the database. We got that JSON back from the database. We converted it back to an object, and then we outputted that object back to our screen for our results. So if everything works copacetic here, we should be able to show, let's see, Chevy. It really doesn't matter at this point because we already entered one in when we tested earlier. So I'm going to put Chevy Ford 2005 just to show you that when we add Okay, I paused there for a second because I did have an error message, and I just want to point this out to you really quickly. Under databases, it's create table if not exists with an S at the end. If you forget that, it'll try to write the table over top of the old table without permissions, and it'll give you an error message. So that was a typo. I just wanted to make sure that you knew about it. At any rate, I created a new field now, or a new record. But what you're going to notice is when I click retrieve, I'm not going to get this record. I'm not going to get anything unless I tell it to retrieve it, which is a very important thing also. Sometimes you lose track of this. Under my button, I need to send my button to the right place here when I click retrieve, and that is get object string from database. That's where it all starts. Okay. Now we're going to run again. And I'll even show you another record we'll add in. We'll call this one a Dodge Dart. Make it a 2015. We'll add that, and you'll notice it says Dodge Dart 2015. But when I hit retrieve, it gives me an error message. Okay, now you notice I got an error message here when I tried to retrieve. And this is what I was telling you about before. If you had a record and the record it was not zero, it would pick up the record and it would show it to us. Because for some reason there's not a record 0, it's not showing it to us. So now I'm going to show you how to use our database tool over here. Hopefully you installed this correctly and you found it up here in the corner, or you placed it in the corner. I'm going to show you how this works. What we need to do is find where our database record is. And the way we're going to do that is to go to our Solution Explorer and double click on our app manifest. And under our app manifest, you're going to see packaging. This number here, you're going to want to highlight this package name and copy it, Control C. Now you go to your Windows Explorer, go to your C drive, Users, Your Name, App Data, which is a hidden folder, by the way. You may have to unhide that folder. Local, and go to Packages. And over here in the search, for search packages, you're going to paste that number, and it will bring up that folder. So you double click that, and you go to local state. And here is your database file, okay? So what you want to do is click up on the top of here, and this will give you your entire run, the actual path to your car's DB. And copy that with Control C. You go over to Data Connections, right click, add a SQLite connection, and it will bring this window up here. And in this window, all you need to do is go to Data Source, Control V to paste it back in, and don't forget this part. You need to do /cars.db, and then test the connection. It should succeed. If it succeeds, it found your database file. You click OK and click Close, and you'll see it'll pop up here on the right. Now the only thing is I need to make sure I get the right one here. I have another one on here from something else, so I'm going to remove that other connection. Okay, so this is your database file. So now we're able to just plug down through here and go to our tables, and we see that our car info table was created, and there it is. We can see what's on it, the ID and the car. And if we right click on car info and edit top 200 rows, we can see the records that we have. And you'll notice there's two records on here. One of them is the Chevy Ford one that we did, that's number 1. And one of them is the Dodge Dart one that we did, and that's number 2. Now you notice the ID numbers here, ID 1 and ID 2, there is no 0. So now if I go back in here and I go to read records under our get object from database, and I change this to either 1 or 2, whichever one I want to do. I'll do 2 just to be special. And we run this again. This time I don't even need to add anything. I just click retrieve, and there's our Dodge Dart 2015. Doesn't matter what we add, it matters what's in the database. So now you can see that you wrote to a database, it pulled the information back out of the database, it created an object, it put that information into the object, and it allowed you to use that information from the object as an object back to your main screen. And all you had to do was save one thing, the object car. Now, like I said, there's a lot more to do with, how you govern what your user puts in the boxes for validation and so forth and security. That's all a totally different subject. This should give you the basic idea of how to put in and take out information from your database. This is kind of a cheesy example for the lookup. I wish I would have done it a little differently. Just for the sake of being extra long on this, I just want to really quickly see if I can go through and correct some of this here. So what I don't like is I don't like looking up by the record ID. So what I'm going to do is, this is going to require a little ingenuity here, but I'm going to save a track, and we're going to just save that as the same thing. Make it easy. Make sure that's not null, and put a comma. Okay. So we just added track to our thing. Now we want to make sure this is going to work, so we need to go to our Explorer. We need to find this file, that database file, and delete that so that it creates a new database file with the new information in it. So now we lost the records that we had. Okay. Now here we're going to do a string track. Okay. And what we're going to do here is call this track. And we're going to change this from ID. We're not going to look at the ID anymore. We're going to look at track, the field we just added. So now if the track equals whatever track we sent in, then it'll return that, whatever car is set up for that track. Okay. We actually don't even have to return the track name or anything. You could. When we write the database, though, we need to write the track. So here we're going to add the car and track. And again, we just need the same kind of setup here. Comma. And make this track. And then we need to add this here. We need to send track in. That's going to be a string. Okay, so we write that in. We read the record back. We're just going to return the car for that track. And we created the database with track. So that should be all right. And I just want to show you how this works. Actually, we're going to have to add a text box here. And we're going to add a text block so that we know what it is when it's running. And we'll make this track. Make this TV track. And now we take the text box out of there. We'll save that. And now we need to go on our main page and correct our lookup here. So what we're going to look up is tb track.text. However, we need to make sure that we are entering that in when we're sending our database information. So we built our car object, which is not going to include track. The car object is still by itself, so you don't change that. Here we go. See how we have the error? And the error is because if we look at the definition for this, we need to have another field. See, we need our string for car and a string for track. So our string for car is my car string. And then our string for track is tb.track. Oops, tbtrack.text. Okay, now we're not returning it, so none of the other things should be, but I just want to give you a better idea here. So now we're going to run the search cells here if I didn't miss anything. We need to add a record or two. So we're going to do track A. And we're going to say track A is the Chevy Camaro. We like that one for track A. Okay, it's 1982. And we're going to add that. Okay, now for track B, we're going to make that a Ford. Ford Mustang. We'll leave the year the same. And we'll do one more track C. And I'll make that our Dodge Dart. Make that 1980. I don't know. Okay. Now, we should be able to, so we can do A. We can retrieve that as Chevy Camaro. We can do B if we do a capital B, and that's our Ford Mustang. And we can do a C and get our Dodge Dart. So there you go. That's how you can look up your record. You make a lookup field and look up the record. Now, you notice that we save track as its own field, car as its own field. And car contains everything for the car, and track just contains that one text, the string for track. So that allows you to keep more than one object or more than one thing. Now, you can only use strings to compare. You can't compare an object to an object, at least not this way. There may be a way out there to do that. My assumption would be you would have to pull out each object, you would have to deserialize each object, and then pull out of the object what you want it to save, or what you want to compare it to. And that's a long process. So if you just keep the lookup field outside of your objects and just keep it a simple field, it's a lot easier to look up that way. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it taught you a little bit about SQL servers and how to use them along with your universal Windows apps. You notice that it's using the package data, and it'll be using the local folders in the app data to keep the information, and it's all stuff you have permission for on the phone or on the computer. So it makes it simple that way as far as permissions go. And that's about it. You can actually take an object now, and you can put that object into a database and not lose the objectability about it. You can pull that information back out and use it as an object again, and you know how to look it up. So that's going to be it for this time. Until next time, I'll see you later.